Alexander Wilson Drake was an American artist and critic. He was born in 1843 in Westfield, New Jersey, the son of Isaac Paine Drake and Charlotte Osborne. Having studied wood engraving under John W. Orr, he was a professional wood engraver in New York from 1865 to 1870. Between 1870 and 1881, he was art director for Scribner's Magazine. He initially married Hilla Tanner Lloyd, and was later married to Anne Lidd. He organized the Bartholdi Loan Association to build the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty. In 1884, he was one of the 9 founders of the Grolier Club, a society for bibliophiles. He possessed a vast collection of needlework, printed chintz, glass bottles, pottery, rings, paintings, prints, and more. He died in 1916. Among the pallbearers at his funeral were inventor Walter Leighton Clark and illustrator Charles Dana Gibson. He only ever published 3 stories in the century, between 1893 and 1894. These were enthusiastically read by Albert Bigelow Paine, who years later tried to convince Drake to write more. But though he had more stories he wished to tell, he was old and infirm, and thus died before having written them. Paine helped issue the ones he did write, along with some poetry, in 1916 as 3 Midnight Stories, issued in a run of 500 copies, and given out to friends and family after Drake's passing. The book contains memorials to Drake from writer and diplomat Robert Underwood Johnson and editor Clarence Clobwell. I shall only focus on the fiction, as I do not have much to say of Drake's short poetry, and am not an authority on poetry in general. In The Yellow Globe, the narrator sees a well-to-do gentleman staring at a yellow globe in a druggist window for several weeks in a row. The narrator speaks to him, and he says the hope of his life is tied to the heart of the yellow globe. He then takes the narrator to his rooms, full of strange mirrors with movable frames, ship lanterns, hanging globes full of coloured fluids, and a model of an English manor house made of clay with assorted miniatures. These are all gathered at great expense to allow the man to create the perfect embodiment of a haunted house, spending years alone to decide on the colour of the lights. There is nothing really fantastic, aside from a hint of fear in the man's voice when he remembers the window he once saw of a different real manor house. The curious vehicle takes place on a foggy December midnight. As the narrator enters the street, he sees a strange olive-green covered vehicle with all glass windows. The front seat is occupied by a man in a buffalo robe, utterly motionless. The narrator waits for some time, but nothing happens. But he has another chance on Christmas Eve. Being invited in from the cold, he sees the carriage is really a small studio. It turns out the person inside is an old widower, who lost his wife after but a few years of a contented life on a small quaint farm. He has since devoted his life to travelling the streets at night, looking at the electric lights, to paint the perfect halo so he can paint his wife as the Madonna. The Lucent Chord is the story of a balloon, a songbird, and the people of an old Mississippi town, who take the arrival of the singing balloon as a miracle to coincide with the dying hour of little Rose Danion, setting up the balloon and the stuffed songbird in the altar of St. Mary as a site of annual pilgrimage. These stories have a curious, fantastic tone to them, each being a light-hearted fantasy showing great imagination.